Let me start with a question. Think about the first time you ever voted. Or if you haven't voted yet, think about the first political opinion you remember having. Where did it come from? Was it a policy paper? A detailed economic argument? A spreadsheet? Or was it something you heard at the dinner table? A comment from a parent? A joke from a friend? Something you saw online? A feeling about what kind of person you were supposed to be? For me, this definitely came from the people around me. Growing up, politics was always present, even when not explicitly discussed. Certain parties were spoken about with warmth, others with suspicion. You could feel which opinions were normal, and which would cause silence in the room. Nobody ever said, "This is how you must vote," but the message was still clear. Years later, when I'll walk into a voting booth, I'll be alone. But really, I'll not be alone. My family will be there with me, my upbringing, the people I surround myself with, my sense of who I am and who I'm not. And that is true for all of us. We often like to think of voting as this clean, rational moment. But in reality, the mind that enters the voting booth is already full. Full of emotions, full of loyalties, full of stories. Today, I want to talk about what really happens in that moment, and why understanding it is important for freedom and democracy, especially here in Europe. Let us be honest with ourselves for a moment. If voting were purely rational, elections would be easy to predict. Everyone would read the same information and reach similar conclusions, but that does not happen. Instead, we see voters make choices that confuse experts. We see sudden swings. We see deep polarization. This is because the human mind does not work in the way we pretend it does. Most decisions are made quickly, emotionally, and intuitively. Logic often comes later, to explain our choices to ourselves and to others. This effect is especially strong in politics, because when you vote, you are saying something about who you are, about where you belong. And that is also visible in Europe. In recent European elections, in some parts of Europe, political loyalty runs through generations. In some families, you vote a certain way because your parents or grandparents did so, because it is tied to labor movements, religion, regional pride, and historical memory. In Central and Eastern Europe, for example, memories of communism still shape the way people feel about the state, authority, and freedom. For some, strong government feels safe. For others, it feels threatening. These feelings do not come from reading today's policy proposals. They come from lived history. And feelings matter. We often underestimate how powerful stories are in shaping our political opinions. In recent European elections, we have seen parties succeed not because they had the most detailed plans, but because they told the most compelling story. Stories about lost control, stories about national identity, stories about protection or renewal. Another powerful source is social momentum. Let me ask you another question. Raise your hand up if you ever felt more confident about an opinion when you realized that most people around you share it. Of course you have. We all have. In Europe, this is especially visible during the election campaigns. As polls shift, conversations shift, and suddenly, supporting a certain party feels acceptable, or even exciting. People do not just vote for what they believe, they vote for what feels possible. This is why turnout changes, why undecided voters often move late, why entire regions can swing together. Now, this brings us to a difficult question. If voting is so influenced by emotion and identity, is democracy weak? Well, it can be. Democracy relies on human psychology, and human psychology can be manipulated. Fear spreads faster than calm. Anger travels faster than nuance. We see this across Europe in debates about immigration, sovereignty, climate, and the European Union itself. But here is the hopeful part. Awareness changes everything. Freedom is not just the ability to choose, it's the ability to understand why you choose. When you recognize that a feeling is influencing you, you gain distance from it. Not to erase it, but to examine it. Am I voting out of fear or out of values? Am I following my community or my conscience? Am I reacting or reflecting? This kind of awareness is a democratic skill, and it is one we rarely teach. It also creates empathy. When you realize how many different forces shape your own vote, it becomes harder to see others as simply irrational or evil. Instead of asking, how could they vote like that? You start asking, what kind of experiences shape their hopes, their fears, and their sense of belonging? This kind of shift is crucial in Europe. European democracy depends on pluralism, on many cultures, languages, and histories coexisting. If disagreement turns into moral hatred, the system breaks down. This, however, is not only a European issue. We have seen this even in countries like Myanmar. After decades of military rule, voting there was not just about outcomes, but it was about identity and hope. When the military refused to accept the elections and seized power, it showed us how fragile democracy becomes when fear, power, and history override the respect for the public's choices. So, what can we do? First, we can slow ourselves down. Fast emotions dominate politics. Slowing down creates space for reflection. Second, we can step outside of our bubbles, not to argue, but to listen. Third, we can talk about politics in more human ways, sharing experiences rather than just statistics, asking questions instead of just delivering verdicts. And finally, we can demand more from our democratic institutions. Media that rewards depth. Education that teaches emotional awareness and critical thinking. Leaders who inspire without manipulating. The voting booth is often described as the heart of democracy, but I think it's more like a mirror. It reflects who we are, our fears, our hopes, and our histories. If we dare look into that mirror honestly, democracy becomes stronger, not because we become perfectly rational, but because we become more conscious. And in a world full of noise, consciousness is one of the most powerful forms of freedom we have. Thank you.